Becky Cooper uncovers the shocking truth behind the murder mystery. Hook. What if the darkest part of you was the one thing you could never escape? Becky Cooper has faced the unimaginable. But when the lines between reality and nightmare blur, will she find the truth or be consumed by it? Stay tuned to discover how the most chilling murder mystery is hiding the ultimate secret. And it's closer than you think. Becky Cooper sat at the edge of her bed, the faint glow of the streetlights outside flickering through her window. The air felt thick, heavy. Her breath seemed to come slower, a strange weight pressing against her chest. She looked down at the paper in her hands, the letter. Her fingers trembled as she turned it over, the thick parchment crinkling softly. The words on it were sharp, urgent, almost a warning. Find out who did it before it's too late. The message was simple. Too simple. But Becky knew. She had to know. The murder, the one everyone had whispered about for weeks. It had been just another small-town mystery. A story, a tragedy. Nothing more. At least, that's what she had thought. The wind outside howled suddenly, rattling the window. Becky jumped, the sound unnerving her. She hadn't heard the wind pick up. She hadn't even noticed how late it had gotten. Her gaze shifted to the clock on the nightstand. It was well past midnight. A sudden thought struck her. What if she wasn't alone in the house? The silence felt too loud, too thick. Her heartbeat seemed to echo in her ears. She glanced toward the door. It was open. She didn't remember opening it. Her mind raced. There was no one else here. But the door, how had it opened? Becky stood up slowly, her legs stiff. She took a step toward the door, her breath shallow, the hairs on the back of her neck rising. A creak, just barely audible, echoed from downstairs. Someone was there. Her pulse quickened, her every instinct screaming at her to run. But her feet were frozen to the spot. Another creak. Closer this time. Becky turned toward the stairs. The darkened hallway stretched out before her like a maze of shadows. The house seemed to grow smaller, closing in around her. She felt it then, the unmistakable presence of someone or something watching her. The door to her bedroom slammed shut. She gasped, stepping back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle the scream that almost escaped. There, standing in the doorway, was a shadow, a figure, but no face. Only darkness. It was moving closer. Becky's heart hammered in her chest. The shadow moved with unnatural speed. She couldn't tear her eyes away. Her breath came faster, quicker. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in, suffocating her. She backed away, but her legs felt numb, unsteady. Each step backward was like walking through thick, wet sand. The shadow stretched, its shape shifting as it neared. A cold gust of air swept through the room, and the temperature dropped. Becky shivered violently, her skin prickling. It was almost there. Her hand fumbled for the lamp on her nightstand, her fingers shaking with fear. She needed light. She needed to see. But before she could reach it, the shadow surged forward. Becky gasped, stumbling backwards. The darkness engulfed her, swallowing the light from the room, leaving her with nothing but blackness. The air felt dense, like it was pressing against her skin, squeezing the breath from her lungs. Her eyes burned as she blinked rapidly, but nothing changed. It was pitch black, and then silence. A silence so complete, it was deafening. Her mind raced. What was happening? What was this thing? A whisper echoed from the darkness. Soft, but clear. Don't trust anyone. Becky froze, every muscle in her body tense, her body locked in place. The whisper came again, this time colder. Find out who did it. A shiver ran down her spine. The words were familiar. They mirrored the letter she had received. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound escaped. It was as if the very air had been stolen from her. The shadow moved again, but This time, it didn't come closer. It just stood there. Becky felt a pull, something deep inside her, a strange, irresistible urge to move toward it. Her legs gave way as she collapsed to the floor. The coldness surrounded her, sinking into her bones. A figure, no, a face, emerged from the darkness, faint, blurred, as if it were trying to materialize from the shadows. Becky couldn't look away. Her body trembled, her mind screaming at her to run. But her body wouldn't obey. The figure took another step forward, closer, closer, and then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow vanished. The room was silent again, empty. Becky gasped for breath, her chest heaving. The fear still gripped her, but the figure was gone. She didn't understand. She didn't know what had just happened. But one thing was certain. The murder wasn't the mystery anymore. Something far darker was at play. That Becky's heart thudded in her chest, louder now, echoing in the stillness of the room. Her hands trembled as they gripped the edge of the bed, as if the furniture itself could offer some kind of support. She was alone. The shadow was gone. The cold had lifted, but the weight in her chest remained. Her mind raced with 1,000 questions. What was that thing? Who had spoken? Why did it seem so familiar? But the most pressing question lingered. Who did the letter mean? Becky's gaze fell on the crumpled paper still clutched tightly in her hand. She unfolded it again, the words still glaring up at her, demanding an answer. Find out who did it before it's too late. It felt like a command now, an order. She couldn't stay in this house, not after what she'd just experienced, not with the feeling that something or someone was still out there, watching, waiting. The floorboards creaked beneath her as she stood, her legs unsteady, each movement tentative. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to loom larger now, as if they were alive, stretching toward her. Becky shook her head, trying to clear the dizziness. She had to go. She stepped toward the door, her pulse still hammering in her throat. Each step was louder than the last, the creak of the wood beneath her feet, the only sound she could focus on. The hallway stretched before her, long and dark. The stairs beckoned, but something held her back, a feeling, a gut instinct, telling her not to go, telling her to stay. But she couldn't stay, not like this. She reached for the door handle, her fingers brushing the cold metal. The door felt like a barrier, like it was guarding something. As she pushed it open, the house seemed to exhale. A sudden gust of wind blew past her, carrying with it the scent of damp earth. Becky stepped into the hall, feeling the chill of the night air on her skin. A creak sounded from upstairs. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't the wind this time. Something was moving. Becky turned, her eyes scanning the darkened staircase. The movement had been faint, but she knew she wasn't alone anymore. A figure, just a glimpse of it, at the top of the stairs. A shape, her stomach twisted in knots. Was it the same shadow? Or was it someone else? A cold dread settled over her, and yet she couldn't stop herself from moving forward. One step, then another. The stairs groaned under her weight. With every step, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The air was heavier now, the darkness more oppressive. And then she heard it, a whisper, barely audible. "Don't go up there, Becky." The voice was unmistakable. She knew it. She had heard it before. Her blood ran cold. Becky froze, the whisper wrapping around her like a vice. Her body went stiff, paralyzed by the sound. It wasn't just the voice that terrified her. It was the familiarity. It was a voice she recognized, a voice she thought she'd never hear again. Her mother's voice, the woman who had disappeared years ago without a trace. "Don't go up there, Becky." The words hung in the air, a warning, a plea. But the voice was not right. It sounded distorted, like it was coming from somewhere far away, yet it was as clear as if her mother stood right in front of her. The air grew colder, and Becky felt a wave of nausea hit her, her stomach churning violently. The darkness at the top of the stairs seemed to deepen, as if the shadows themselves were alive, waiting for her to make the next move. She had to go up there. She had to. The letter, the shadow, the whisper, it all pointed to the same place. But could she trust her own mind? "Mom," Becky whispered, her voice trembling, barely a breath. There was no answer, just the unsettling silence. She took a hesitant step forward, her feet reluctant, as if they knew something she didn't. Another step, and then another. The stairs groaned under her weight, the sound too loud in the oppressive quiet. She reached the landing, her eyes straining to pierce through the darkness that seemed to cling to the walls, creeping over every surface. There's something up here, something she wasn't ready for. Becky's hand brushed the railing as she moved down the hallway, her fingers cold against the wood. The familiar smell of dust and old wood filled her nostrils, but beneath that scent was something sharper, something metallic, blood. The hallway stretched before her, dark and silent, but there, at the end of it, was a door, the door to her mother's old room, the door she hadn't opened since that night. Becky's breath hitched in her chest as she stood before it, her heart racing again. The room was locked, or at least it had been. It should still be locked, but the door was ajar now, just a crack, barely visible, but enough for her to see inside. Her hand reached for the doorknob, the cold metal biting into her palm. With a sharp turn, the door creaked open. The room was still, untouched by time. Dust coated the furniture, the air stagnant, heavy. But then Becky saw it. A figure, a shadow, hunched over in the far corner of the room, obscured by the dim light creeping through the crack in the door. A voice, low, familiar, whispered again, "Becky, I've been waiting." Becky's pulse skipped a beat, her stomach twisted into a knot. And there, in the corner of the room, she saw something that stopped her heart completely. A body, her mother's body, frozen in time, her eyes wide open, staring directly at Becky. Becky's breath caught in her throat. The room spun around her, the air thick with the stench of decay and stale, forgotten memories. She stepped back, her legs unsteady, but her feet refused to move. The figure in the corner, her mother, wasn't just a shadow. It was real, or at least it had been. Becky's eyes were locked on the body. Her mother's face, pale and frozen in terror, seemed to be staring directly at her, as if begging her to understand. But the longer she looked, the less she recognized the woman. The features were wrong, twisted, almost distorted, like someone had tried to make her look like her mother, but failed. Becky's stomach churned, bile rising in her throat. She couldn't breathe. The room was closing in on her. She had to get out, but her legs, her body, refused to obey. And then, as if the room itself had come alive, the air shifted. The shadows that had clung to the corners seemed to grow, stretching across the walls like dark veins. The floor creaked beneath her as something moved, something shifting. Her mother's body began to twitch, a slow, deliberate movement, her fingers curling, her head jerking toward Becky. Becky's pulse thundered in her ears. Her mother's eyes, those wide, unblinking eyes, followed her every move. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. She was trapped in the room with this thing that looked like her mother but wasn't. The shadows twisted, contorted around the figure, until the face, no longer her mother's face, melted away, revealing something worse. A mask of pure, horrific darkness. It spoke. "Don't run. You have nowhere to go." Becky's mind screamed at her to move, to escape. But the darkness was closing in. The walls felt like they were pressing together, suffocating her. Her eyes darted around the room. She saw nothing but shadows, felt nothing but the suffocating cold. but she knew she had to run. The door. The door was the only way out. Her feet moved slow at first, as if they were heavy with the weight of her fear. But the shadows were faster. They reached out, grasping at her, pulling her back. She fought, desperately, clawing at the doorframe, her heart beating so loudly it was all she could hear. "Don't leave," the voice whispered again, now familiar, but distant. Becky slammed her shoulder into the door, feeling the wood give way slightly. But it wasn't enough. Then, the figure behind her moved again, closer, its footsteps slow but relentless. "Don't you remember?" it asked, the voice so distorted now that it sent chills through her bones. "It's not over, Becky. It never was." A cold hand brushed her shoulder. She screamed. The door flew open with a force that almost sent her stumbling into the hall. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. She ran. Down the stairs. Through the hallway. Out into the night. The wind howled again, but this time, Becky didn't care. She just ran. Past the shadows. Past the whispers. Past everything that had once felt familiar. She didn't look back. Not once. Not even when she heard it, the voice. "Run, Becky. Run." The sound of footsteps followed, but they were far behind. For now, that Becky's breath came in ragged gasps as she bolted through the yard, her feet pounding against the dirt path. The cold night air stung her skin, but it was the terror gripping her heart that made her feel like she was suffocating. She didn't dare glance back. The shadows were still there, haunting her thoughts. The whispers, the footsteps, the face in the dark. Everything felt like it was chasing her, closing in. She pushed forward, her body moving on pure instinct now. The road ahead seemed endless, the darkness swallowing everything around her. She couldn't go back to the house. That much was clear. Her mind spun as she tried to make sense of what had happened. The figure in her mother's room. It wasn't her mother. It couldn't have been, but it was wearing her face, and that made it worse. Becky's feet faltered, her legs weak beneath her. She had run too far, too fast. The panic clawed at her chest, making it hard to breathe. Her head spun, and then she heard it, a sound that made her blood freeze, a soft, rhythmic thud. Footsteps. Someone or something was following her. She didn't dare look. She just ran faster, the world around her blurring. The road stretched on, an endless ribbon of darkened pavement, but Becky could feel the presence behind her. It wasn't just the footsteps. There was something else, something darker, something colder. She turned a corner sharply, almost losing her balance. Her mind screamed for her to stop, to turn around and face whatever was pursuing her. But her legs wouldn't obey. Every instinct told her to keep running, and so she did. The thuds were closer now, louder. Suddenly, she stumbled, her foot catching on something. She crashed to the ground, scraping her palms against the rough pavement. Pain shot up her arm, but she barely registered it. Her chest heaved as she pushed herself up, hands trembling, eyes wild. The footsteps didn't stop. They were right behind her. A whisper, cold and sharp, echoed through the night air. "You can't run forever, Becky." Her heart skipped a beat. The voice. It was that same distorted voice, the one from the room. A shiver ran down her spine, and she scrambled to her feet, desperate to escape, to get away from whatever was closing in on her. But as she looked ahead, she froze. A figure stood in the middle of the road, blocking her path, a tall, dark silhouette, its features hidden in the inky blackness of the night. Becky's breath caught in her throat. She knew that figure. She couldn't mistake it. The same twisted face, the same empty eyes. It was waiting for her. Becky's mind raced. There was no way out, no way to outrun it. She was trapped. The figure took a slow step toward her, and she backed up instinctively, her heart hammering wildly in her chest. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why are you doing this?" The figure tilted its head, the shadow seeming to shift, as if considering her words. "Because," the voice answered, "you were always meant to find out." And then, in a heartbeat, it lunged. Becky screamed as she stumbled backward, but the darkness was too fast, too strong. It enveloped her, pulling her into the blackness, where nothing existed but the silence. The footsteps faded, the whispers stopped, and Becky was gone. The world around Becky was swallowed by silence. Darkness, cold. It was as if she had been dragged into another place entirely, a void where time and sound no longer existed. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The shadows pressed in, heavy and suffocating. She tried to scream, but the air around her was thick, impenetrable. Her body felt frozen, rooted to the spot, as if the very essence of the dark had seeped into her skin, binding her in place. And then, from within the darkness, a faint light flickered, a single, small gleam that barely pierced the black. Becky's heart hammered in her chest. She didn't know why, but she felt an overwhelming pull toward it. She couldn't see clearly, but something about the light felt wrong. It was too bright, too unnatural, as if it didn't belong in this place. But she had no choice. Her feet moved toward it. Each step felt like it took an eternity. The ground beneath her feet felt soft, like mud, but she couldn't see what was there. Her vision blurred as she moved closer. The light grew stronger, but so did the feeling of dread in her chest. And then she saw it. A door. A heavy wooden door, ancient and worn, standing in the middle of this empty space. The light seemed to emanate from it, casting eerie shadows on the floor around it. It was the only thing in the vast emptiness. Becky stopped before it, her breath catching in her throat. Something about the door felt familiar. It wasn't a door from her house, but the feeling was the same. A sense of old, buried memories clawing their way to the surface. Her hand hovered over the handle, trembling. "Open it," a voice whispered. Becky froze. That voice. It was her mother's voice again, but it wasn't the same as before. It wasn't distorted. It was soft, gentle, almost pleading. The fear in Becky's chest only deepened. The voice shouldn't have been so calm. It shouldn't have sounded so familiar. The door creaked, as if responding to her hesitation, inviting her in. She couldn't move. Every part of her screamed for her to leave, to run away from whatever waited behind that door. But something was pulling her in. Something told her she had no choice. Slowly, Becky turned the knob. The door swung open with a low groan, revealing a room bathed in an unsettling, dim glow. The walls were lined with mirrors, each reflecting her image, but distorted, warped, like the face of a stranger. She stepped inside, the air heavy with the scent of mildew and old wood. Her breath came in shallow gasps as her eyes adjusted to the room. It was suffocating, the mirrors seeming to trap her in place, each reflection more twisted than the last. The whispers returned. "You're not meant to be here, Becky," they hissed. "You're not meant to remember." The mirrors shimmered. One by one, they began to crack, small fissures spreading across the glass. And behind each crack, something began to stir. Becky's pulse raced. She stepped back, her heart pounding harder in her chest. Then, in the very center of the room, she saw it. A figure. The figure. It was the same shape, the same presence. Only now it was standing in the mirror directly in front of her. Its face was the same twisted version of her mother's that had haunted her earlier. Its eyes met hers, cold and empty, and it whispered, "It was never about the murder, Becky. You were always meant to be part of it." Her mind screamed for clarity, for understanding, but everything felt so wrong. And then the figure reached out, its hand pressing against the mirror, cracking the glass further. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. The figure stepped through, and it was real. Becky stumbled back, her legs buckling beneath her as the figure emerged from the shattered mirror. The sharp sound of glass splintering echoed in the room, but it was drowned out by the pounding of her heart. Her breath came in frantic gasps as she tried to comprehend what she was seeing. The figure, it wasn't just a shadow or a reflection anymore. It was solid flesh and bone, but its eyes, those eyes, they were empty, hollow, like nothing lived inside them. The twisted face of her mother's distorted image stared back at her, and for a brief, fleeting moment, Becky thought she might lose her grip on reality entirely. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was savoring her fear. The air seemed to grow colder, the room darker, as if the very space around her was shrinking, closing in. The light from the mirrors flickered, casting strange, long shadows that seemed to stretch out and crawl toward Becky. "Why are you doing this?" she choked out, her voice trembling, barely a whisper. The figure didn't answer. It only stepped closer, the glass under its feet crunching as it moved. Every inch it took seemed to pull the air from the room, leaving her gasping for breath. Becky's mind reeled, but her body remained frozen, unable to escape, as if the darkness had taken root in her bones. The figure's mouth moved, and for the first time, Becky heard it speak. But the words came not from the mouth, but from all around her. "You were always meant to find the truth, Becky," the voice echoed, blending with the whispers that filled the air. "The truth about what happened, about who you really are." Becky's heart skipped a beat. The truth about what? What was it talking about? Her mind spun as memories flickered in and out of focus, half-formed images she couldn't grasp. Fleeting thoughts of her mother, her disappearance, the years of unanswered questions. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, I'm not part of this. I don't belong here." The figure reached out, its hand extending toward her, the fingers long and pale, as though they were stretching beyond natural limits. Its touch would be cold, she knew, the kind of cold that could freeze you from the inside out. "You already are," the figure whispered, its voice now low, almost soothing. "You were always meant to remember, Becky. You are the key." The last word echoed in her mind. Key. Suddenly, everything clicked into place, like a door unlocking in her brain. The shadows, the whispers, the strange pull she had felt toward the house, the letter. It had all been leading her here, to this moment, to the mirror, to the truth she had been running from. The murder, her mother's disappearance, the darkness that had consumed her town long before she was born. Becky's eyes widened as a new realization hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't just a witness. She wasn't just a victim of circumstance. She was part of it. She had always been part of it. The figure's hand was almost upon her now, its fingers nearly brushing her skin. The cold was unbearable, a biting chill that made her body ache. She gasped, stumbling backward. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The room had closed in on her, the walls lined with mirrors, each one reflecting the same distorted face. "You have to finish it, Becky," the figure said, its voice almost pleading now, desperate. "You have to remember. You have to finish what was started." Becky's pulse raced. Her head felt heavy, as though it was filled with 1,000 thoughts crashing together. The figure in front of her wasn't just a manifestation. It was a part of her, a fragment of her past that had been hidden, buried deep beneath the surface. She remembered a night she had tried to forget, a night when her mother had gone missing, a night when the shadows first came alive. And in that night, Becky realized she had been there. She had witnessed it all. The door to her past was wide open now, and she couldn't look away. The figure's hand touched her arm, and everything around her fractured. The mirrors shattered, the room dissolved, and Becky fell, asterisk through asterisk the darkness, through the memories, into a place she had never wanted to visit. She saw it all, The murder, the lies, the truth about herself. The figure whispered, its voice now a chilling melody. You were always the one, Becky. You were the key to everything, and as the darkness consumed her, she understood. The story wasn't over. It was only just beginning. That Becky's world spun in fragments, a whirlwind of images and sounds, as if her mind was being torn apart and remade in an instant. The darkness was overwhelming, like it was swallowing her whole, erasing every familiar thing she had once known. She was falling further, deeper, into a place where time didn't exist, where memories twisted and turned like a labyrinth she couldn't escape. The cold was suffocating. It wrapped around her, freezing her thoughts, freezing her body, until everything felt like it was breaking apart. She gasped for air, but it was as if there was none. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. Then, like a lightning strike through the fog, a single image flashed before her eyes. A house. Her house. The same house she had fled from just moments before. The same house that had been her prison and her sanctuary. The house that had once felt like home and now felt like a tomb. But something was different now. The house was darker, twisted, more decayed than she remembered. The windows were shattered, the door ajar, and the shadows inside stretched like fingers reaching for her. She saw it then, the truth that had been buried deep within her. A figure in the doorway, her mother, but not her mother. The face was wrong, distorted, like the figure that had followed her through the mirrors, only clearer now, sharper. It was her mother's face, but it was marred, twisted by something darker. "Come inside, Becky," the figure whispered, its voice dripping with malice. Becky's breath hitched, her pulse pounding in her ears. She knew that voice. It was the same voice from the mirror, the same voice that had echoed in her mind, pulling her back to this place. "No," she said, her voice weak but defiant. "You're not my mother." The figure in the doorway smiled, a twisted grin that sent a jolt of fear through her. "No, I'm not. But I've always been with you. You've always known me, Becky. Don't you remember?" Becky stepped back, her feet unsteady beneath her. She couldn't think straight. Her mind was a blur, and every instinct screamed at her to turn away, to run, to escape. But the door, the house, was calling her. The shadows inside, pulling her in. Her heart raced as she took a step forward, drawn to the figure despite herself. "You were always the key, Becky," the figure continued, its voice soothing, almost tender. "You were the one who brought it all back. You were the one who brought me back." The ground beneath her feet began to tremble. The house shook, the walls cracking and splintering, as if something immense, something ancient, was waking. A low growl, almost like the sound of an earthquake, rumbled through the floorboards. The figure in the doorway didn't move, but its presence filled the entire space, overwhelming Becky. She felt the walls closing in again, the shadows clawing at her, urging her to step closer, to surrender to it. "Come inside," the figure repeated, its voice now a command, a desperate plea. "Finish what was started." The words echoed in her mind. Finish what was started. Becky's vision blurred as memories flooded back. Memories she had buried for years, forgotten fragments of a past too horrible to face. The murder, the screams, the blood, the horror that had consumed her home, her family, her life. Her mother had been involved. Becky had seen it. She had been there that night. But she had pushed it all away, erased the memories, because she couldn't live with the truth. She had always been the key to it all, to the darkness, to the secret buried within this house. She was the one who had brought it back. The house trembled again, and this time, Becky didn't back away. She couldn't. She was standing on the precipice now, and there was no turning back. The figure in the doorway wasn't just a part of her mother. It was part of her, part of the very darkness she had been running from. With a sudden, desperate resolve, she stepped forward, through the threshold, and the door slammed shut behind her. The world collapsed into nothingness, and Becky vanished. The darkness around Becky was suffocating. It clung to her like a heavy fog, blotting out everything. No light, no sound, nothing. She couldn't move. She couldn't see. Every part of her screamed to break free, to find a way out, but there was nothing. No path, no escape. Her breath came in short, shallow gasps, her heart racing. She felt herself falling again, deeper into the blackness, her mind spinning in a whirlpool of confusion and fear. Was she still in the house? Was she somewhere else entirely? And then, from the void, a sound emerged, faint at first, but unmistakable. A whisper. Becky's body tensed. She knew that voice. She had heard it before in the house, in the mirror, in her nightmares. It was the same distorted voice. "You're still here, Becky," it said, low and dark, sending a chill through her bones. She couldn't tell where it was coming from, but she knew it was speaking directly to her. "Why don't you remember?" the voice whispered again, soft but persistent. "It's all yours. All you're doing. You've always been part of it." Becky's stomach churned. She wasn't sure if it was the voice that terrified her most, or the crushing realization that she might not have a choice. She had always been a part of this, the darkness, the house, the twisted memories. She had run from it for so long, buried it so deep, but now it was too late. She had never truly escaped. A flicker of light appeared in the distance, far away, like a candle burning in the dark. Becky's legs moved before she even registered the decision. She walked toward it, her footsteps echoing in the void, growing louder and louder with each step. But as she drew closer, the light shifted. It twisted, bending into something she didn't recognize. It wasn't a light at all. It was a door she knew, a door she had passed through, a door that had always led her back to the beginning. The same door she had just come through. She stood frozen, staring at the door, the faint light flickering from beneath it. The voice spoke again, louder this time, almost triumphant. "You can't escape, Becky. Not anymore." Her mind reeled. It was true, wasn't it? She had opened the door. She had walked through it. And now, here it was again, this same cursed door, leading her back into the same cycle. The same trap. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The weight of everything crashed down on her. The suffocating realization that no matter what she did, she would always return to this place. The door swung open slowly, as if inviting her in, but the figure was standing on the other side now. The same figure, the same distorted face, but this time it wasn't just watching her from the doorway. It was waiting, its eyes locked on hers. "You should have remembered sooner, Becky," the figure whispered, its voice thick with an unnatural calm. "You were always meant to come back, to finish it." Becky's heart thudded painfully in her chest. She tried to step back, but her body wouldn't move. The air around her was thick, and she felt like she was trapped in some kind of twisted loop, every step, every breath leading her straight back here. The figure stepped closer, its eyes now gleaming with a sinister light. "There's no escape," it said, the words cold and final. "This is your story, Becky. You wrote it, and now you'll live it forever." Becky's mind screamed. She could feel the weight of the truth crushing her. She wasn't just a part of this story. She was the story. She was the key that had unlocked this nightmare, the one who had unwittingly set it all into motion. The house, the darkness, the murder. She had been running from the truth, but there was no more running. There was no more escaping. The figure's hand reached out, its long, cold fingers grazing her skin, and everything went black. The story wasn't over. It had only just begun. The darkness pressed in, heavy and suffocating, wrapping around Becky like a vice. She tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the void. Her limbs were frozen, her body still as if it had been trapped in time. There was no escape, no way to move. The figure's touch was cold, so cold it numbed her skin. Her heart pounded in her chest, a frantic beat that felt like the only thing keeping her tethered to this world. But there was no escape, no refuge in the silence. The figure loomed over her, its distorted face so close that she could feel its breath, icy and unnatural, on her skin. "You thought you could outrun it," the voice rasped, sounding so familiar yet alien at the same time. "But it was always part of you, Becky." She didn't respond. What was there to say? The weight of those words pressed down on her, making her chest ache. The shadows around her began to shift, curling like tendrils, stretching across the ground toward her. It was as though the very room, the very air, was alive, wrapping itself around her, drawing her deeper into its depths. She could feel herself sinking, falling into the dark. The figure stepped forward, its face twisting into something even more grotesque. The once familiar eyes of her mother were gone, replaced by an emptiness so vast it seemed to consume everything in its path. "You were always meant to find it," the figure whispered again, its voice now coming from all directions surrounding her. The truth, the key. Becky's mind raced, but there was nothing she could grasp. The truth. What truth? Hadn't she already faced it? The truth of the house, the truth of the murder, the truth of the figure haunting her every step. Hadn't she already acknowledged it? But the truth was elusive. It was always just beyond her reach, just out of focus, like a broken reflection in a cracked mirror. Suddenly, the room shifted again. The ground beneath her feet wavered and became unstable, tilting as if it was alive. She felt herself falling, but there was no ground to catch her. She was weightless, suspended in the air as the darkness around her twisted into shapes that mirrored fragments of her memories. The house, the faces, the blood, the screams. Her vision blurred, and before her, a figure appeared, a child, small, innocent, but somehow out of place in the blackness. The child's eyes were wide, terrified, like it knew something Becky didn't. Something important, something that made her heart drop into her stomach. "Help me," the child whispered, its voice barely audible over the growing static of the darkness around them. The child's hand reached out toward her, but it wasn't just a plea. It was a command, a call Becky couldn't ignore. She reached out, her trembling fingers brushing the child's. But the moment her skin made contact, everything around her shattered. The room fractured like glass, splintering into pieces, and in the instant before she could react, Becky was thrown back. The house, the mirrors, the whispers, it was all crashing down, breaking apart in a violent rush. And in the chaos, she saw it, asterisk the truth star, the figure that had followed her, the face that had haunted her. It was her own face, reflected back at her in the shattered pieces of the mirrors. She wasn't running from the darkness. She was the darkness. She had always been the one pulling herself back into it. The child in front of her had faded, its form vanishing as quickly as it appeared, leaving Becky to face the truth alone. And then the mirrors, the shattered reflections, began to piece themselves back together. Each piece of glass clicked into place, forming a new reflection. Not just of her, but of everything, the house, the blood, the twisted memory of that night. And Becky saw it, her mother, her own twisted, broken reflection, the one that had been hiding all along, the one who had caused it all to. Becky's breath caught in her throat as the shattered mirrors reformed, each jagged shard clicking back into place, one by one. The darkness seemed to hum with energy, swirling around her as the pieces of glass came together, aligning to form a grotesque, distorted image. Her reflection stared back at her, but it was wrong. It was twisted, just like the figure that had haunted her. The eyes staring back at her weren't her own. They were cold, hollow, empty, like a void she could fall into. She was staring at a version of herself that had never been there before. The woman in the mirror wasn't the Becky she thought she knew. It was a version of her mother, her own face, but aged and cracked, broken, like a reflection of everything Becky had tried to bury. The face in the mirror grinned, its lips curling into a slow, malicious smile. "You've always known, Becky," the reflection whispered, its voice echoing in the room. "You've always known who you are, what you are." Becky took a step back, her body trembling, but she couldn't escape the mirror. The reflection drew her in like a magnet. Every part of her fought it, screamed at her to run, but her feet felt glued to the floor, paralyzed by the truth she was finally being forced to see. The image of herself began to shift, distort, and then, with an eerie fluidity, it stepped out of the mirror. The figure was identical to her, yet impossibly different, wrong in a way that made her skin crawl. "You were always meant to return," the figure said, its voice still a warped version of her own. It took a step closer, and Becky's heart slammed against her ribs. "This is your story, Becky, your legacy. It's not your mother you've been running from. It's you." Becky's mind spun. Her legacy? No, it couldn't be. She wasn't a part of whatever dark thing this was. She wasn't the one who... But as she thought it, she felt a strange pull in her chest, a connection she couldn't explain. It was as though her own body was betraying her, drawing her in, forcing her to confront the truth that had always been just out of reach. The figure in front of her stepped forward again, its hand reaching out to her. "No," she gasped, her voice trembling with fear, but also something else. Something deeper, a recognition she couldn't escape. The figure's hand brushed against hers, and as their skin touched, the flood of memories rushed back all at once. The blood, the screams, the darkness that had haunted her. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't just an observer. She had done it. The truth tore through her like a knife. The murder, her mother, the secrets buried beneath the floorboards of that house. Becky wasn't running from the monster in the mirror. She was the monster. The reflection, the twisted version of herself, smiled wider. A grin that stretched unnaturally and whispered, "You were always meant to find your place, Becky. The darkness inside you has waited so long for you to remember, to finish it, to become it." Becky's head spun as the weight of the truth pressed down on her chest, suffocating her, squeezing all the air from her lungs. She gasped for breath, but the room felt smaller now, like it was closing in, trapping her in the very place she had always belonged. She tried to pull away, tried to escape, but the mirrors were everywhere. Each one reflected a different version of herself. Each one a fragment of the truth she had been running from. And then, with a sudden jolt, she realized something. The mirrors weren't just reflections. They were portals. They were doors, each one leading her back to a different part of her life, a different part of her past. Every reflection was a memory. Every mirror was a piece of her story. And the figure, the twisted, distorted version of herself, wasn't just her past. It was her future. Becky's pulse quickened as she understood. There was no escaping it. There never had been. She had been the one pulling herself back into this nightmare, again and again. She was the key. The key to what? To becoming something darker, something more powerful, something that would keep the cycle going forever. The figure's grin deepened. "It's time for you to claim it, Becky. To finally become what you were always meant to be." And as Becky's reflection stepped closer, blending into her own image, she felt the darkness surge through her, cold and all-consuming. Her eyes widened in horror as she realized the truth. The monster wasn't a stranger. It wasn't someone else. It was her. The mirrors shattered around her, and Becky vanished into the dark. The story was far from over. The darkness swallowed her whole, and for a moment there was nothing. No sound, no light, no sense of self. Then, slowly, the void began to shift again. A cold wind brushed across her skin, sharp and unsettling. Becky's breath was ragged, her chest tight as she tried to pull herself together, to make sense of the madness that had claimed her life, her mind. But there was no escaping the pull. The feeling that everything, every piece of this twisted story had been designed with her in mind. She had been led here, step by agonizing step, and now she was no longer sure what was real and what was only a shadow of her own unraveling mind. A light flickered ahead, not a warm, comforting light, but something harsh, unnatural, like a cold, distant star struggling against the dark. It pulled her forward despite herself, despite the screams in her head that told her to turn away. But there was no turning back now. As Becky stepped toward the light, it grew brighter, more intense. And with the brightness came the realization that she was not alone. The figure, her reflection, was there again, standing in the light, waiting for her. This time, there was no distortion, no twisted version of herself. It was her. The figure was her, and she was staring back at herself with a look that was too calm, too empty. "Welcome home, Becky," her reflection said softly, its voice echoing in the silence. Becky's heart thundered in her chest as she took another step closer, her legs trembling. No, this can't be happening. But it was happening. She felt it. Every inch of her being screamed that this was the end. Her end. The truth, the twisted reality she had tried to outrun, was here now, here with her in the flesh. "You've been running from this for so long," her reflection said, its smile widening. "But there's no escaping your own nature. You're part of this. You are this." The air around Becky thickened, pressing in, like it was closing in on her. She felt the walls of the space tighten around her, the light dimming as the truth flooded her mind. She had done it all. She had created this nightmare. The figure in front of her wasn't just a reflection. It was a manifestation of everything she had ever been. Every broken memory, every hidden piece of herself that she had tried to lock away. The murderer, the liar, the monster. Her breath caught in her throat as the realization hit her like a tidal wave. This was her fate. This was her legacy. She had been the one to set it all in motion, the one who had woven the darkness into every corner of her life. And now it was too late to turn back. The reflection took a step toward her, its hands outstretched, and before Becky could react, it reached forward and placed its cold hand on her chest. In that instant, something shifted deep inside Becky, a cold, numbing force that made her feel like she was no longer in control of her own body. The reflection wasn't just taking over, it was merging with her. She felt herself being consumed, her own mind and soul merging with the dark presence that had always been there, waiting for her to finally realize the truth. "You were always meant to lead this," her reflection whispered, its voice now a chorus of 1,000 echoes, each one more menacing than the last. To become one with it, Becky's body trembled, her mind shattered as she tried to fight, to break free. But there was no fighting. There was no escape from the endless darkness that now consumed her. The light began to flicker once more, but it was no longer comforting. It was a warning. The truth was too heavy. She had created this hell, and now it was her eternal prison. The world around her warped, the mirrors spinning faster, the shadows creeping closer. The house, the blood, the screams, they were all coming back, all merging into one. And as the darkness engulfed her completely, Becky realized that the story was not just hers to live. It was hers to repeat. Forever the darkness wrapped around Becky like a suffocating cloak, closing in tighter with each breath she took. She could feel herself slipping away, fading into the very shadows that had always been her torment. The light, so bright, so deceiving, flickered again, only this time it wasn't drawing her in. It was pushing her toward the endless abyss where everything she had feared resided. Her heart pounded in her chest, her body trembling with the weight of the truth. She had been here before. This place, this moment, she knew it. It was the same dark room, the same twisted reflection of herself. But now it wasn't just a reflection. It was her, every part of her darkness, every broken piece of herself she had tried so hard to bury. She wanted to scream. She wanted to tear away from it all. But her mouth was dry, her throat raw. She was paralyzed, her limbs heavy as if they no longer belonged to her. "Don't you see, Becky?" the reflection whispered, its voice now more like a growl. "This is where you belong. This is your truth." The words burrowed into her mind, clawing at her sanity. She couldn't escape. She couldn't escape from herself. The figure wasn't just some force haunting her. It was a part of her. The asterisk part of her she had tried to outrun for so long. The part that had always been there, buried deep within her, waiting for her to finally realize the truth. She had done it all. The murder, the lies, the darkness. She had created it. She had been the one to tear apart her own family, to pull the trigger, to cover up the truth. Every step she took had led her here, to this place of infinite mirrors, where the reflection of her twisted soul could never escape. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed to the ground, her hands shaking as she pressed them against the cold floor. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't feel anything except the crushing weight of her own guilt. The reflection stepped closer, its form blurring with every movement. "You can't run anymore. You can't hide from what you've become." Becky's breath caught in her throat. "No, no," she whispered, her voice barely audible as she clutched her chest, as if trying to hold her heart in place. But it was no use. The darkness seeped into her skin, into her soul, a cold fire that consumed everything. She could feel it. She was losing herself, becoming part of it, part of the endless void that had always been inside her. The figure bent down, its hand reaching for her face. It was her hand, her own hand, but impossibly cold, impossibly distant. "It's over, Becky," it said softly, almost lovingly. "You've always known the truth. You just refused to see it." Becky closed her eyes, her tears mixing with the darkness that now surrounded her. The room shifted again, the walls closing in like a vice, but this time she didn't fight it. She couldn't. The weight of the truth was too much. She had always known. She had always been a part of this. The house, the blood, the horrors, and now she was nothing more than a reflection of it, a reflection of the darkness. The figure's voice echoed around her, soft, almost serene. "Now you can finally rest, Becky. Now you can join us." The last thing Becky heard was the sound of her own heartbeat, slowing, fading into the silence of the endless night. And then there's nothing. The story that had started so long ago in the depths of that haunted house was finally complete, and it would never end. There was no light, no sound, just a vast, unending blackness. Becky's mind drifted, like a leaf on a river, carried by currents she couldn't control. Her body, her very self, felt like it had dissolved, becoming nothing more than a whisper in the darkness. The crushing weight of everything she had faced, everything she had become, seemed to stretch into infinity. Time didn't exist here. There was no beginning and no end. Just silence, but then a flicker, a pulse of light, so faint it barely registered at first, but it was enough to draw her in. The cold was still there, biting at her skin, but the light, it was a promise, a chance. Becky reached for it. Her mind screamed for it. She had to reach it. She had to understand. The light grew slowly, then faster, bright and blinding, filling the void with a searing intensity. It pulled her forward, lifting her, dragging her back from the abyss. And then, just as suddenly it vanished. She was standing, her legs unsteady beneath her, but solid. She could feel the ground beneath her feet, cold and cracked, but real. The air was thick with the remnants of everything she had tried to escape. She looked around. The house again, standing in front of her unchanged, as if it had never fallen into ruin. The walls were whole, the door still ajar, the same twisted shadows lurking behind the windows. And then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. The mirror. It was the same mirror, the one that had once haunted her, the one that had shown her the twisted version of herself, the one she had avoided for so long, the one that had been the gateway to all of this. The mirror was whole now, its surface perfectly smooth, like glass that had never been shattered. Becky's pulse quickened. Her reflection, was there, staring back at her. But this time, it wasn't just her. Behind her reflection, something moved. A shadow, dark, formless, like something waiting, watching, just beyond the reach of the light. Becky stepped closer to the mirror. Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't want to see it. She didn't want to confront what was behind her, but she couldn't stop herself. It was drawing her in. Her reflection smiled. And then, just as quickly, the shadow behind her stretched, its shape shifting, twisting into something monstrous. "No," Becky whispered, her voice shaky, but the word carried with it a truth she couldn't deny. The shadow, the darkness, wasn't just a part of her past. It was with her, always waiting to take her back, to drag her down into that same spiral of violence, terror, and guilt. She backed away from the mirror, panic rising in her chest. The shadow moved again, faster this time, its form growing larger, more defined. It was reaching for her. "No," she shouted, her voice breaking. "I won't go back." But the house around her began to shift, as if it were alive. The floor beneath her feet buckled, the walls closing in on all sides. The air grew thick with an oppressive presence, and the shadows, her own shadow, began to twist and contort around her. She could feel it. The darkness was swallowing her again, pulling her into its grasp. It wanted her back. It wanted to consume her, make her part of it forever. Becky's vision blurred as the room around her spun. The mirror, the shadow, they were merging now, becoming one, pulling her back into the very thing she had tried to escape. But then, just as she thought it would all collapse, she saw a flicker. A sliver of light, a momentary break in the darkness. Her hand reached toward it, and then everything stopped. The house, the shadow, the mirror. They all paused, frozen in place. In the stillness, she heard a voice, soft, familiar. "It's not over." Becky turned. The voice was coming from the doorway, the same doorway she had crossed through so many times, the one that had always led her back into the house. A figure stood there, just beyond the threshold, silhouetted against the dim light. It wasn't the reflection. It wasn't the figure she had seen before. It was her, the real her. And this time, her reflection didn't move. It was silent, waiting. And for the first time, Becky realized that there was no mirror between them. No barrier, just her. And the truth, Becky stood there, frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure in the doorway, the one that looked like her but wasn't, stood unmoving, as if waiting for her to make the first move. The silence between them was suffocating. The air hung heavy, thick with the weight of everything she had been through. Every lie, every murder, every piece of her shattered reality. She was standing on the edge of it all, the precipice of something darker, something deeper than she could have ever imagined. Her mind raced. The mirror. The reflection, the shadow that had followed her. It was all part of her. It had always been. The figure in the doorway, her real self, stepped forward, its presence like a force that pulled her in. Becky's body felt heavy, as though the very ground beneath her was trying to hold her down. "Why are you here?" Becky whispered, the words catching in her throat. "What do you want from me?" The figure's lips didn't move, but the voice came clear, sharp, cutting through the silence. "You've always known, Becky," it said, its voice echoing in her mind. "You've always known what you are." Becky's chest tightened as the words landed. She felt the truth in them, like a knife slipping beneath her skin, cutting deeper and deeper. She had run for so long, hid behind mirrors, hid behind lies, but now she couldn't escape. She reached out, but the figure stepped back, its expression unchanged. The darkness in the room shifted, swirling like a living thing, crawling toward her feet, whispering in her ears. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The mirror shattered. The pieces splintered into countless fragments, scattering across the floor like shards of a broken soul. And in each piece, she saw it, the truth. It wasn't the reflection that had been the monster. It wasn't the house. It wasn't the shadow. It had always been her. Her eyes burned with tears she couldn't shed. She could feel it, the weight of the guilt, the weight of the endless cycle she had been trapped in. The figure in the doorway turned away, its form dissolving into the shadows. It was leaving her. "No," Becky gasped, her voice raw. "Don't leave me." But it didn't stop. The door closed behind it, and the room was plunged into darkness once again. Becky's breath came in short, frantic gasps. She was alone again, alone with the pieces of her shattered self. The house seemed to shift, the walls bending and creaking as if they were alive, watching her, judging her. She could feel their cold eyes on her, feel the weight of everything pressing in. And then, from the corner of the room, a new sound emerged. Soft at first, a low hum, faint but growing louder. Becky turned toward it, her body stiff with fear, but she couldn't stop herself. She had to know. She had to understand. The sound grew, warping, bending, until it was unmistakable. A voice. Her voice. "Wake up, Becky." Her blood ran cold as the words echoed through her mind. The hum, the voice, it was all around her, wrapping itself around her like a cage. "Wake up," it said again, sharper this time. And then it all clicked. The room, the mirrors, the house, the darkness. This was it. The final stage. The endless loop she had been running through her entire life. She had always been a part of it. The murder, the lies, the guilt. It was never going to end. The pieces of the mirror, scattered on the floor, began to pulse with light, each shard glowing with a soft, eerie radiance, as if beckoning her closer. She reached for one. Her fingers brushed the cold, jagged edge, and as she did, a wave of memories flooded her mind. Fragments of moments, of choices she had made, of the terrible things she had done. Each memory collided with the others, blurring, distorting, until they were no longer separate. They were all the same. The house, the murder, the endless cycle. Becky's vision blurred, her mind tearing apart as the pieces of the mirror pulled her deeper into the truth. She wasn't just part of the story. She was the story, the house, the shadows, the blood. They were hers to control, hers to repeat. And as the light of the mirror flickered one last time, the voice echoed through her mind, louder, final. "Wake up, Becky. You're not done yet." The pieces of the house, of her story, began to shift again. The door opened. The darkness swallowed her whole. And once again, the cycle began. But this time, there was no escape. The door slammed shut behind her, plunging her back into the endless, suffocating darkness. The room seemed to spin, the walls breathing in and out like a living thing. Becky's head throbbed, her thoughts scattered, desperate to make sense of the cycle she had found herself in. Her body felt as though it were floating, drifting through the shadows, each breath a struggle. The house around her whispered. She could hear it, faint at first, murmurs from the corners, soft as the rustle of paper. But as she focused, the whispers grew louder, taking shape, becoming words. They weren't just voices anymore. They were her own. Asterisk, it's time, asterisk. Becky's heart lurched in her chest. Time. Time for what? Hadn't she been through this already? Wasn't she trapped in this nightmare, forced to relive the same darkness? Over and over again, she tried to speak, but her voice faltered. The silence swallowed her words. The air around her thickened, and she was suddenly aware of the sharp smell of blood. The same smell she'd known for so long. It was a scent woven into the walls, into the very floorboards of the house. It was the smell of the thing she had become. She stumbled forward, her legs unsteady, her mind spinning. The air was cold, but the deeper she walked, the warmer it grew. The temperature was rising, the walls closing in like they were suffocating her, pushing her toward something, toward someone. A shadow moved ahead, flickering at the edge of her vision. She couldn't see it clearly, but she knew it was there, waiting for her to follow. She knew it wasn't a person. It wasn't human. It was the darkness. The shadow turned, and in the split second before it vanished, Becky saw something. No, someone. Standing in the distance. A figure. She couldn't make out the details, but it was tall, unnaturally still, its presence commanding the very room. Asterisk, Becky, asterisk. The voice came again, sharp and familiar. The same voice she had heard so many times, the voice that had haunted her dreams, taunted her with the knowledge of her guilt, her reflection. But this time, the voice wasn't just in her head. It was real. It echoed through the room, wrapping around her like a noose. Come closer, it beckoned, and Becky felt herself drawn toward the figure. The pull was magnetic, impossible to resist. With each step she took, the air around her became heavier, suffused with the scent of decay and something darker, something ancient. She reached the figure, and then she saw it, her reflection. But it wasn't like before. It wasn't distorted. It wasn't twisted. This time it was clear. It was her, but not her. The reflection was standing before her, smiling. It looked calm, at peace. It radiated an unsettling serenity. "Why are you running, Becky?" the reflection asked, its voice low, echoing in her chest. "Why keep trying to escape when you already know the truth?" Becky's heart raced. She didn't understand. She had tried to escape so many times, tried to run from what she had done, from what she had become. But each time, it had dragged her back. Each time, she had found herself staring into the mirror, confronting the same terrifying truth. "You can't hide," the reflection said again, its smile never wavering. "You never could." Becky wanted to scream, but her voice wouldn't come. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move. She was frozen, trapped in the suffocating presence of the thing she had created. "You've been looking for a way out," it continued, its voice a soft whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once, "but there is no escape. You've known it all along." Tears welled in Becky's eyes as the room around her began to shift. The walls stretched, the shadows twisted, until the space was unrecognizable. She wasn't sure if she was still in the house or somewhere else entirely. The darkness was so deep, so thick, it felt like it was pulling her under. The reflection's smile widened, a grin full of something dark, something cruel. "This is where you belong, Becky. This is where it ends." The room felt like it was collapsing inward, and yet the figure remained perfectly still. It was always there, always watching. Becky couldn't breathe. The weight of it all was too much. The truth was suffocating, drowning her. And as she stood there, surrounded by the darkness she had once feared, she realized something. It wasn't the house that had kept her trapped. It wasn't the mirror or the shadows. It was her. She had always been the one keeping herself in this place, this endless loop of terror, guilt, and darkness. She had been the one pulling herself back into it time and time again. The reflection reached out, its hand cold and unyielding. "Join me," it said softly. "Let it end." Becky's heart faltered as she reached out, her fingers brushing against the reflections. And the moment they touched, the room went black. Everything stopped, and Becky knew, with a certainty so deep it rattled her soul, there was no escape from herself. The cycle would continue. Always the silence swallowed her whole. There was no sound, no movement, no sense of time or space, just a vast, crushing nothingness. Becky stood still, feeling the weight of the moment pressed down on her. The reflection's touch lingered on her skin, cold and unrelenting. She couldn't tell if she had stepped into it or if it had consumed her. The feeling was both terrifying and familiar, like she had been here before, like this was where she had always been destined to end up. Her heart hammered in her chest, but she couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. It was as though she were trapped in a state of suspended animation, her body heavy and unresponsive, her mind swirling with fragments of memories, regrets, and haunting whispers. The darkness pressed in on all sides, suffocating, but in the depths of it, she saw something, a faint light. It flickered in the distance, not warm or welcoming, but sharp, cold, and distant, like the glow of an old, dying star. It beckoned, calling to her. She didn't want to go toward it. She didn't want to confront whatever it was. But the pull was undeniable. It was stronger than the terror, stronger than the shame. Slowly, she took a step toward the light, her body moving of its own accord. The air around her grew colder as she moved forward, her breath now visible in the freezing void. The light didn't grow warmer. It didn't soften. It stayed cold, distant, as if daring her to approach. With each step, the light grew clearer, revealing a figure in its center. A silhouette, vague at first, but then more distinct as she drew closer. It was her face, her body, her eyes, empty and hollow, staring straight at her. Becky froze, unable to move, her pulse thudding in her ears. The figure didn't speak, didn't move, just stood there, frozen in place, a mirror of Becky herself, but twisted, unnatural. She could feel the reflection's gaze on her, cold, knowing, as if it was watching her every move, understanding everything she had ever been, everything she had ever done. Every piece of her soul was laid bare before it. This is it, Becky realized, her mind clouded by fear and disbelief. This is the truth. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't trying to escape. The darkness, the house, the endless cycle. It had all been an illusion, a game she had played with herself, trying to avoid what she had created. The figure's lips parted, its voice soft and cold. "You thought you could outrun it," it whispered, "but you can't escape your own reflection." Becky's throat tightened. I didn't mean to," the words were meaningless. She knew that now. They couldn't undo the past. They couldn't erase the blood, the lies, the choices that had led her here. "You are your own prison," the figure continued, its voice echoing, distorting with each word. "You were never free. Not from the beginning. Not from the end." The light flickered again, and in that flicker, Becky saw something. A shadow, moving swiftly behind the figure. Something dark, its edges shifting, blending into the light, but then pulling away as if it were afraid of being seen. It was the shadow from before, the one that had stalked her every step, the one that had been there, always just out of reach, like a constant reminder of her sins. It was her, 2. The parts of her she couldn't face. The parts she had tried to bury. Her reflection stepped closer, its hand extending toward her. Becky didn't move, couldn't move. She could feel the pull now, as if the darkness was rising, swirling around her feet, wrapping around her legs. "You're not who you think you are," the figure said, its voice low, almost a growl. "And you never were." Becky's mind raced, but it was too late. The walls began to shift again, the space warping, twisting as the light began to fade. The cold grew unbearable, seeping into her bones, freezing her from the inside out. And then, in an instant, everything snapped back. She was standing in the house again. The room, the same door, the same haunting silence. But there was something different this time, something new, something that hadn't been there before. The door was open, and in the doorway stood the reflection, its hollow eyes staring at her, its mouth curved into a twisted smile. "You've always known what this was, Becky," it whispered, its voice now 1,000 voices, all echoing together. "You've always known this was the only way." The door behind her slammed shut, sealing her in. But this time, Becky didn't fight. She didn't scream. She didn't try to escape. She knew deep down that she never would. The cycle wasn't just something she had been caught in. It was her. It was who she was. And there was no end. There was no way out. Becky took one last, steadying breath as the darkness closed in around her. And as the silence stretched into eternity, she understood. The story was never hers to finish. It was only hers to repeat. Becky stood motionless, her heart pounding in her chest. The door, once an escape, now felt like a trap. The reflection, the twisted mirror image of herself, loomed in the doorway, its eyes cold and unblinking, as if it had always been there, waiting for her. For a moment, everything stopped. The house, the darkness, the weight of her guilt. It all seemed to hang suspended in time. And then the reflection moved. Slowly, it stepped forward, its presence like a cold gust of wind, pushing Becky back, as if it were pulling her toward the inevitable. The room around her seemed to warp, to bend in unnatural angles, until she felt as though the walls were closing in on her, the ceiling lowering, the floor tilting beneath her feet. The reflection's smile widened, its lips curling in a way that made Becky's skin crawl. "You've been running for so long, Becky," it said, its voice low, almost mocking. "But there is nowhere to run now. There's only here. Only this." Becky's throat tightened. Her mind was a blur of memories, of faces, of voices. The guilt, the horror. She had done terrible things. She knew that. But there was something else. Something deeper. Something that had always been a part of her. The darkness wasn't just a consequence of her actions. It was her, woven into the very fabric of who she was. The reflection reached out, its hand cold and trembling, not in malice, but in something far worse, something that beckoned Becky to step closer. It wasn't an order. It was an invitation. Becky's legs felt weak, but she didn't retreat. She didn't run. She didn't want to fight anymore. The reflection had always been a part of her, and it was time to stop pretending it wasn't. Time to stop hiding from what she had become. Her hand shook as she lifted it toward the reflections, and as their fingers met, the house around her vanished. The darkness consumed her, and she was no longer in the room, no longer in the house. She was everywhere. The light was gone. The whispers, the shadows, the fear, they were all gone. And there was only one thing left. Her. In the absence of everything else, in the silence that stretched on forever, Becky understood. There was no escape. There never had been. She wasn't just trapped in the house. She was the house. The darkness pressed in around Becky, suffocating, as if it were part of her skin. She felt its cold touch in her bones, in the depths of her very soul. The silence that followed the loss of the house, the shifting walls, the reflections, it was unbearable. Yet in that stillness, in that profound quiet, there was something else. Something she hadn't allowed herself to see before. For the first time, she wasn't running. She wasn't fighting. Becky stood there, feeling the weight of her choices, feeling the pulse of the very things she had tried so desperately to escape. The guilt, the terror, the lies, they weren't external forces, they were hers, intertwined with her, inseparable. And in that moment, she realized the truth. The house had always been a reflection of her own mind, her own fractured soul. It had never been a place of escape. It was simply a manifestation of the darkness she had carried inside her for so long. She could feel the weight of everything, every wrong decision, every mistake. It was all there, pressing down on her. But it wasn't crushing her. It wasn't drowning her. It was just there, and she didn't have to run from it anymore. Her reflection in the endless void had shown her the way, had shown her that the real battle wasn't with the house or the shadow or the mirror. It was with herself. She closed her eyes, taking in a slow, steady breath. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel it all, the pain, the regret, the sorrow. But she didn't fight it. She didn't try to bury it. She accepted it. And in that acceptance, something shifted. The darkness that had swallowed her began to fade, not with violence or force, but with quiet, gentle ease. The weight on her chest lifted, and she felt the air around her clear. The walls that had once seemed so oppressive, the shadows that had loomed so large, they faded into the background, as if they were never really there at all. The house, the reflections, the cycles, they all began to dissolve into nothingness. And as she opened her eyes, she found herself standing at the edge of a new beginning. The darkness was gone. The endless loop